But again, our best assessment is less than 20% over the last 24 hours now. We've seen to start to reposition. And I want to hit it again because I think it's an important point. If the Russians were really serious about de-escalating and the way they spun this yesterday, that they're trying to take the pressure off, well, then send them home. And that's not what they're doing, at least not yet. David?
So just to be clear on the what troops you're talking about here, there were basically 3 lines of advance on Kyiv: northwest, northeast, and east.
I would say from the north and northwest, those groupings are the ones that they're drawing from now.
So does that include Chernihiv?
Yeah, it does. We do think some troops that were arrayed against Chernihiv have also been part of this repositioning. And as well, further to the east, there's a town called Sumy, S-U-M-Y, and we think some of those troops have also repositioned into Belarus. Bonnie?
So John, is it wrong to say that, I mean, you're using the word reposition. I'm trying to understand the situation. Is it wrong to say that Russia withdrew some of its forces from around Kyiv?
They are beginning to move some forces away from Kyiv. If you want to call it withdrawal, I'm not going to argue with you on the verb. I'm using reposition on purpose because the way it's being spun by the Ministry of Defense is that they're pulling back and they're trying to de-escalate and depressurize the situation, and we just don't believe, we haven't seen any evidence of that right now.
But if we separate it from the whole de-escalation, because clearly you're saying there's still bombardment, they're using missiles, they're using artillery.
That's right.
Not necessarily the center of the city, but the Kyiv Oblast.
I don't know where they're landing.
No, this is according to our reporting. But the forces, regardless of the escalation, Russia is withdrawing some of its troops away from Kyiv.
They are repositioning some of their troops away from Kyiv, yes. Sylvie?
Yes. Do you see more troops going in the direction of Donbass, as they say they would refocus on Donbass?
Again, we haven't seen, you know, of the small percentage of troops that we have observed that they are repositioning, we haven't seen any of them go elsewhere inside Ukraine. All I would tell you is that the Russians have said themselves they're going to prioritize the Donbass region. We have seen them become much more active there in the last few days. For instance, we think that the Wagner Group now has about 1,000 people dedicated to the Donbass. We have seen an increase, I shouldn't say an increase, we have seen them prioritize airstrikes in the Donbass area. So if you look at, again, I'm not, you know, I can't count every single, and I'm not going to count every single artillery shell or missile strike, because they continue to bombard population centers through the air. That's Mariupol, that's Chernihiv, it's Kharkiv, it certainly is Kyiv. But generally, where we see them prioritizing the airstrikes now, it's in the north, with the exception of Mariupol. It's largely in the north. It's Kyiv. It's still Kharkiv. It's still Chernihiv, and it's in the Donbass. So when we're talking about what they're doing in the Donbass, we know they've added now private military contractors. We know that they're prioritizing some of their airstrike activity there in ways that they weren't doing before, and we know that they're considering other ways of reinforcing, as well as what I said yesterday is we can see them make a concerted effort to try to occupy more territory in the Donbass. Yeah.
Can you explain what the reason would be for them sending troops from the Wagner Group into the Donbass
region?
Sure,
but you have to tell me who you are and what.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you for taking my question. My name's Liz Fried, and I'm with Fox News.
Okay.
Can you explain maybe the concerns that the U.S. would have about them sending those private troops to the Donbass region and their reasons for doing it?
Well, I mean, think couple of things. They have used Wagner contractors in the Donbass over the last 8 years. So this is an area where the Wagner Group is experienced. So it's not a surprise that they would try to look at using private military contractors there. Number two, we think it's a reflection of the very tough fighting that continues to go on there in the Donbass, and Mr. Putin's desire to reinforce his efforts there. You guys asked me yesterday, show me how we think he's prioritizing. That's one of the ways why we think he's trying to prioritize the Donbass region. Yeah.
So the department has released its budget, and now we're in budget season. You'll be going to the Hill, justifying what you want to do with the annual budget. And I'm sure lawmakers will want to know what the department is doing vis-a-vis Russia and this new reality of Russia invading Ukraine and being an acute threat. What will be the department's response to Congress? How will it describe what it's doing to kind of counter this new reality with Russia?
I think if you look at the budget itself, and the reason why we wanted to do a national defense strategy in concert with the budget was to show that the budget is strategically aligned with what we're trying to do in this department. And of course, China remains the pacing challenge, the number one concern for the department. There's no doubt about that. But as you said, we refer to Russia as an acute threat. You don't have to look any more than what you've been seeing over the last month to see the threat, the kinds of threats that Russia can pose to international security. And so, if you take a look at the budget and the investments we're making, for instance, in research and development and scientific and technology, $130 billion, the highest watermark ever for this department in terms of R&D investments. A lot of those capabilities, cyber, space, 5G, artificial intelligence, hypersonics. You look at all that stuff, and yes, it will certainly help us against the pacing challenge of China, but it absolutely will help us against what we consider the acute threat of Russia. Let me go to the phones here. Tara Kopp.
Hi, John. Thanks for doing this. So with the movement of the forces away from Kyiv, are you also seeing a movement of equipment and artillery, or is it just personnel that's departing? Thank you.
No, I mean, when we're seeing units go. So it's our assessment that they are also bringing much of their equipment with them, again, for refit, we believe, for refit and repurposing for future operations inside Ukraine. But look, I mean, Tara, I can't count every vehicle, every rucksack that these guys are moving with them. But it's our assessment that their intention is to reposition these units so that they can refit them for future operations. Oren Lieberman, CNN.
A question specific to Mariupol. Given the destruction that you're seeing there, would you characterize that as the Russians carpet bombing the city or conducting a scorched earth campaign there? Or would you not use that sort of terminology in terms of what you're seeing?
It's devastating what we're seeing there. I'll let experts decide how they want to characterize it or label it, but it is obviously devastating. You don't have to look any further than the imagery that your network is showing, as well as so many other news outlets, to see just how significant the damage the Russians are doing in Mariupol, and the devastating effects that it's having there on what can only be described as the civilian infrastructure, residential buildings, hospitals, recreation parks, everything. I mean, the place is just being decimated from a structural perspective by the onslaught of Russian airstrikes. Caitlin, Stars and Stripes.
Hi, John. I'm just trying to break down some of the jargon I'm noticing in the budget and the NDS explainer. Can you just describe for us what's the difference between an acute threat and a pacing threat?
Okay, we'll try this again. We call China a pacing challenge because in many of the military kinds of capabilities that we know we are going to need to respond to what is an increasingly aggressive China in the Indo-Pacific specifically, and the potential threats that those capabilities mean for us, that we're going to have to stay ahead of those capabilities. And again, you look at the budget, you can see the kinds of capabilities that we're investing in for the future to make sure that we are not just keeping a pace with China's military modernization, but that we are staying ahead of it. We are ahead of it now, we believe, We need to stay ahead of it. And as for an acute threat, what we're talking about here with Russia is this is a military that remains potent, and if you want proof of being an acute threat, a specific threat, a relevant, timely threat, if that's the way you want to describe acute, that's the way we would certainly look at it. Look at places like Mariupol. Look at the question that Oren just asked. You can see it for yourself that they're very much posing a threat right now, in this time frame, acutely on the European continent, and that's what we refer to when we talk about an acute threat. Megan.
General Walters at UCOM told lawmakers this morning that there needs to be some sort of repositioning of permanent and rotational forces in Europe. And he said that he talked to lawmakers about it. You've said in the past couple of weeks the Pentagon, that's a discussion in the Pentagon. Is that part of the posture review that was completed last year? Can we expect in the next few months or this year any announcements about moving permanent basing around or having different kinds of rotational deployments in Europe?
I'm not going to get ahead of decisions that haven't been made, but I think it's safe to assume that given what Russia has done over the last month and the ways in which the security environment on the European continent have changed, and I use that as past tense, not present tense, you can bet that senior leaders here at the department are going to take a look at our European posture going forward. Now, again, I can't tell you, when a decision is going to be made one way or the other, or what that's going to look like. But the Secretary absolutely wants to keep an open mind about European posture going forward, clearly because of the acute threat of Russia, and clearly because of the way the security environment in Europe has changed. So, could it mean more troops, more permanently based in Europe? It could, but again, no decisions have been made right now.
Sounds like this has been a discussion with UCOM for a lot longer than these last couple of months with Russia.
Well, it was part of the posture review, sure. I mean, when we put the posture review together, we absolutely spoke to General Walters and our allies and partners as we sort of game that out. But of course, that was completed well before Mr. Putin decided to invade Ukraine. So we're going to keep an open mind, Megan. The security environment is different now. And however this war ends, and we don't know when, and we don't know what that's going to look like, I think we are working under the assumption that Europe's not going to be the same anymore. And so, therefore, we probably shouldn't have the same outlook to our posture in Europe. Now, again, what's the blend going to be between temporary and rotational deployments versus a permanent posture? We don't have that figured out right now. The other thing I'd say, because it's really important point to make, whatever decisions we make, they're going to be in lockstep with the allies and partners. I mean, we're going to do this in full consultation because some nations are simply going to be more eager for additional U.S. force presence than others, and we have to respect that.
Right. So my question is, this discussion's been going on a lot longer than just the Ukraine conflict. So have you already begun some of those consultations and those negotiations with those countries, keeping in mind that you've been having this discussion for a lot longer than just this year?
Yes, we've had these discussions going on before the invasion, clearly. But in terms of post-invasion posture decisions, no. Now, look, we've been to Brussels twice in the last couple of weeks. The Secretary has visited Poland and Germany and Slovakia and Bulgaria. And in every one of those conversations, when he meets with his counterparts, there's a discussion about U.S. leadership in the region and what it means and what they want it to look like. So, I mean, I'm not going to walk you away from the idea that informal discussions are happening. Of course they are. You would expect that to be the case, I mean, given what Mr. Putin has done. But in terms of hard-nosed negotiating, sitting down and with pen and paper and mapping it out, what it's going to look like long-term, no, we're not at that point right now. Yeah.
Assistant Secretary Wallander told the House panel today that the DoD is working with Slovakia to identify the requirements for meeting Slovakia's need in case they provide their S-300s to Ukraine. Could you please detail that work a little bit? What are you guys doing with the
Secretary said as much when we were in Slovakia, Kasim. So that's absolutely right. We are doing that. I'm not going to detail from the podium consultations we're having with an individual nation state about capabilities that they might be willing to provide Ukraine and what the offset might look like. But we are absolutely having discussions with them about that.
Also, General Walters, responding to a question today, acknowledged that the U.S. pulled out its destroyers out of Black Sea just before the Russian invasion, and he added that the U.S. should return to the Black Sea as soon as possible. What was the calculus of pulling these ships out of Black Sea then? And do you have a plan, or is there a discussion in the department to send back some ships to the Black Sea?
I think, look, we move ships in and out of the Black Sea routinely. It's not unusual. I mean, we don't keep them permanently in the Black Sea, but we absolutely have moved them in and out as needed. And it was deemed a prudent decision to do it as we continue to see an invasion is more imminent, to make it very clear to everybody that the United States was not interested in enforcing a conflict by some posture decision that we were making. So it was the prudent thing to do at the time, and I don't have anything to announce with respect to if and when U.S. ships will go back into the Black Sea. We watch and monitor this every day, and we'll make the best decisions based on what's in the best interest of our national security and that of our allies and partners as well. Over here, way in the back there. Kelly?
Okay, yeah. Thanks. I know you can't go too much into this, but how dangerous is it that Putin is not being informed by his advisors on what is happening on the ground? And are we in touch with the top Russian military leaders yet? I know you had said that they had declined to engage just last week.
Yeah, no conversations to speak to yet. We maintain our willingness to have those discussions, but it's a two-way street. The Russians have to be willing to pick up the phone, and thus far they've not been willing to do that. Obviously, it understandably would be an issue of concern if for not just our European allies and partners, but certainly for Ukraine, if Mr. Putin is misinformed or uninformed about what's going on inside Ukraine. It's his military. It's his war. He chose it. And so the fact that he may not have all the context, that he may not fully understand the degree to which his forces are failing in Ukraine, that's a little discomforting, to be honest with you. And it's certainly one outcome of that could be a less than faithful effort at negotiating some sort of settlement here. If he's not fully informed of how poorly he's doing, then how are his negotiators going to come up with an agreement that is enduring? Certainly one that respects Ukrainian sovereignty. The other thing is, I mean, you don't know how a leader like that's going to react to getting bad news. So yeah, it's disconcerting. Felicia.
Hey, John. Thanks for taking my question.
Yeah.
Any notable observations or assessments since it came up yesterday on Ukrainian counterattacks? And I'm wondering if you have, or like efforts to take cities back, and I'm wondering if you have some sort of, I don't know, top-line assessment about how they're doing overall.
I don't have anything today in terms of specifics. Just broadly speaking, Felicia, we've seen them counterattack and retake territory to the west and to the northwest of Kyiv. As we see some Russian troops reposition and move away, we have seen indications that the Ukrainians are moving forward, as you might expect them to do. Where it's really notable is in the south. I mean, when we were talking early on, remember these are sort of three lines of axes that the Russians have used, north, east, and south, generally speaking. And in the south, they had made the most progress in the first couple of weeks. And now the Ukrainians are literally clawing back some of that territory, particularly just to the northwest of Crimea, so the Kherson area and the positioning of the Russians around Mykolaiv, which they now have lost a lot of footing there. So we've seen the Ukrainians very tough in trying to get back territory there in the south. Now, Mariupol, again, I don't need to tell you this because you guys are all covering it, but that obviously there is a lot of heavy fighting going on right there. We think that there are some Russian forces that are very, very close to city center. The Ukrainians are fighting very, very hard. It is the town is just being shellacked with airstrikes and bombardment, as we talked about earlier. Both sides fighting very, very hard over Mariupol. From a geographic perspective, clearly it's very important to both sides because of where it's located, right there at the southern sort of end of the Donbass region.
I think it's 3 today. That's okay.
You had 3 yesterday.
I know.
I counted.
First, thank you. A clarification. You had said that there had been more airstrikes in the Donbass and increased activity there. And you had said that there were still airstrikes in the Kyiv area and that they had pulled back. Would you call it a decrease in activity in the Kyiv area, or is there a significant reduction in airstrikes? Like, how has that changed, or has it changed, aside from the 20% that kind of pulled back?
I don't, we weren't counting missile strikes on Kyiv, so I can't give you an honest answer in terms of like whether it was more today than yesterday. What I would just say is generally the city continues to be under threat of airstrike and bombardment. We are continuing to see that. So even as the Russians reposition some of their troops, and before that, before they started to reposition, they were in a defensive crouch, basically. They weren't advancing from the ground anymore in the city. But even with all that, we continue to see that the city is very much under threat from airstrikes.
Okay, thank you for clarifying. Secondly, how many missiles has Russia launched into Ukraine at this point?
I couldn't give you an exact number, but it's, as I said yesterday, it's definitely more than 1,000.
Okay, and then finally, I apologize if I missed this, but when you were talking about the Wagner Group, do you know where they're coming from? General Townsend had told VOA earlier that there was recruiting going on in Africa. Can you tell us where they're coming from specifically? Is it Syria, or they being?
I couldn't give you their roster and where every single employee of the Wagner Group are coming from. All I can tell you is that we do think they are going to prioritize the Donbass area. That we have indications that they plan to put 1,000 or so of their contractors in Donbass. Where they're all coming from, I don't know. We have seen indications that the Wagner Group is recruiting in places like Syria, in places like Northern Africa, Libya. But how many are of that 1,000 or so, where they're, I don't have that level of detail. The point is that it's just another example of how Mr. Putin is gonna throw more energy into trying to occupy the Donbass. Now, to what end, we're not exactly sure. Certainly, so far, he has not been successful in that either. But we believe that they are going to prioritize that part of the country.
So did you say Wagner is recruiting in Libya to fight in Ukraine?
I said we've seen the indications that they want to recruit out of places like North Africa and Syria, yes.
Specifically Libya?
I said Libya, yes.
To fight in Ukraine?
Yes. Mike?
A question about the 20%. Refitting a mechanized unit is a significant logistics challenge requiring maintenance, munitions, POL, everything. Are you seeing any examples of that happening with the support elements coming in to refit, or are you just assuming at this point that they will be refitting?
Too soon. No. As I said, we've only just beginning to see this repositioning. It's a minor percentage of the total force that they had to the north and northwest of Kyiv, and we believe the intent is to in many of these cases to bring them into Belarus so they can be refit and resupplied. But it's just now starting, Mike. So I don't really have anything more specific to speak to. And look, Mike, I mean, we may never have that level of detail for you. I mean, it's we do the best we can to tell you what we're seeing, but we're not going to see everything. Yeah.
How close are they going back from? You say the repositioning from.
Well, I mean,
where
look,
to
I mean,
where?
again, they were, again, Mike, I mean, we're only just beginning to see this. So we assessed that the closest that their advanced elements got to the city center of Kyiv was about 15 to 20 kilometers. So it's the forces that were arrayed around the hostile airfield that we believe those were the ones that have begun. They're the first ones to begin this movement north. But again, I couldn't tell you where they are on the road right now or where exactly they're gonna end up. Tony.
Can you give a status report of the latest tranche of Stingers, Javelins, and Switchblade drones that the president authorized when he signed?
What I can tell you is that material is getting into the region every single day, including over the last 24 hours. We are in the first half a dozen shipments of what will probably be around 30 or so of this $800 million that the president signed out. So it's already moving into the region. I don't have an inventory list for you, Tony, about how many are on every flight, but we're doing the best we can to prioritize the kinds of material that we know the Ukrainians need the most. And so obviously that includes some of these anti-armor and anti-air defense systems. But I don't have a shopping list for you today.
Are those little drones starting to be
They have not shipped in yet, but we think that will change relatively soon.
I need to ask you about this the use of the word acute. I know I don't want to be cute, but you've mentioned a few times here. I need to ask you this. General Van Herrick, the Northern Command commander, said 5 days ago that Russia is the primary military threat to the homeland, and their focus on targeting the homeland has provided the model other competitors are beginning to follow. And then General Walters last year, about a year ago this month, said Russia is the primary threat, it's the existential threat against the United States. And I'm just asking you, acute sounds like a step down from existential and primary threat, and almost a deliberate attempt to de-emphasize Russia and overemphasize China. This is going to come up as an issue, so I'd like you to address it.
No, it's a fair question. I mean, it's not about de-emphasizing Russia. Nobody's de-emphasizing Russia. We've said many times here, certainly you and I have talked about this many times. I mean, nobody's taking the Russian threat lightly, nor should we. Now, yes, they've underperformed. They've made pretty big mistakes in Ukraine. Planning and execution-wise, of course, they've also faced a much stiffer resistance than they anticipated. But nobody's shortchanging the kind of threats that they continue to pose. And you can see it for yourself. My goodness, just take a look at the video and the imagery coming out of Ukraine, and you can see the damage that this military is capable of exerting and causing. But the Secretary has been nothing but completely candid from literally day one that the pacing challenge, in his view, for this department is China. In the manner in which, the expense at which China continues to modernize their capabilities, continue to bully their neighbors, coerce other nations in the region, and to continue to expand the militarization of the Western Pacific. That cannot be ignored, nor will it be by this department. I know everybody wants us to rack and stack. We've been very honest. China remains the pacing challenge. Russia, we still assess as an acute threat. I understand the interest in the adjectives here, but it would be imprudent for us not to try to characterize the threat that Russia poses and to try to deal with it. And again, look at the budget. I mean, my goodness, how many budgets have you reported on? Take a look at it, and you can see that the kinds of capabilities that we're investing in are not just going to help us with the pacing challenge of China, but they will also help us deal with the threat that Russia continues to pose.
Why are you mentioning that? The Nuclear Posture Review cancels the sea-launched nuclear cruise missile that the Trump administration pushed. That doesn't sound like beefing up to deter against Russia. You're cutting a nuclear weapon. What's the rationale for that cut?
I'm not going to talk about the specifics of the Nuclear Posture Review. It remains a classified document, Tony, so I'm just not going to go there. But I'm not going to go there except to say, go look at the budget we just submitted, and look at the billions of dollars that we committed, more than 30, I think, $billion, just to keep modernizing the triad. So, thank you. I should have figured you'd have the exact figure more than me, but nevertheless, more than $30 billion to modernize the triad. Nobody's sloughing off or taking for granted the fact that we need a strong strategic nuclear deterrent and that we're willing to invest in keeping it strong. Yeah.
Joseph Bush at Autobia English. You mentioned China being the #1 threat.
I said China is the pacing challenge for this department.
Can you talk about any conversations with Chinese counterparts in recent days here? And have you seen any signs or indications that of Chinese military assistance to Russia? Is that still a concern?
You see no indications of Chinese military assistance to Russia. I don't have any conversations at the very, very senior levels of the department to read out. It's like Russia. It's not like we don't have a military-to-military multiple communication channels to speak with the Chinese. It's not like there's a blackout there, but I don't have any conversations at the secretary's level to speak to today. Alex Horton, Washington Post.
Yeah, thanks, John. In testimony the last couple of days, there was some talk about the intelligence picture on the lead up to the war, and Walters, suggested that there could have been, gaps in intelligence, both underestimating the Ukrainian fight and overestimating the Russian ability to win this thing quickly. Have you guys started your post-mortem on that thing? I mean, it definitely has an end. Once the war started, you can close the book on it. So I know it's ongoing, but it seems like you guys can start doing an assessment of how, on one hand, you got it very right about their intent to invade. But on the other hand, you got it very wrong in your assessment that, Kiev would fall within days and the Ukrainian military would dissolve. Can you?
Look, I want to make a couple of points here, Alex. This is not a war the United States is fighting. So I wouldn't expect that there'll be some formal after-action review, the way we are conducting one, for instance, on the last year or so in Afghanistan. Obviously, the intelligence community, the interagency will, I'm sure, informally, at the appropriate time, take a look at what we have learned by watching and seeing how Russia has underperformed and how, quite frankly, amazingly, the Ukrainians have performed. I mean, obviously, we all want to learn from things as we see them, and we're going to learn from our own behaviors here. Our efforts to help defend Ukraine or help Ukraine defend itself. We'll certainly, at the appropriate time, take a look at how we performed in that regard. We'll certainly, at the right time, take a look at how hard we worked to bolster NATO's eastern flank. And to Megan's question, I'm sure there will be lessons we'll learn there about what the posture in Europe ought to look like going forward. But I think it's too early right now, Alex, to sit down and wring hands over specific intelligence assessments. You're right. We did say for a long time that we had indications that Russia was going to invade. While certainly the performance of the Ukrainians on the field of battle has been amazing and incredible and inspiring, it's not, and I've said this before, it's not like their performance it came as a shock to people here at the Pentagon. It wasn't by accident. I mean, we are all focused, and rightly so right now, as they're in the middle of a fight, on the security assistance and the materials, the weapon systems that they still need to have that fight. But let's not forget the training and the support that we have been giving the Ukrainians for the last 8 years as they've been engaged in a hot war in the Donbass. And it's not just us, the Brits, the Canadians, and other nations in Europe who have also lent training support to the Ukrainians. So their success on the field of battle is not an accident. It's the result of a lot of hard work over the last 8 years. Phil Stewart, Reuters.
That up front, I mean, why didn't that change your calculus that Kiev would fall very quickly?
Get into specific intelligence assessments over Kyiv falling or not falling, Alex. So I don't think we ever publicly acknowledged a certain range of dates or hours or weeks with respect to Ukraine. I understand that there are officials out there that are talking like that and did talk at the time, but there was never an official position by the department about how long Kyiv would hold out. Phil Stewart.
All right, thanks. Two quick questions. One, has there been a date to reschedule the ICBM test, the Minuteman test? And secondly, there have been a lot of videos out there filmed by Ukraine of Russian POWs. Have there been any discussions between the Pentagon and the Ukrainian military about any concerns that the Pentagon might have about doing that? Thanks.
Rescheduled. On prisoners of war, I'm not going to get into individual discussions and conversations with Ukrainian leaders over that issue. I would just say that that our expectations and the expectations of the international community is that all prisoners of war will be treated in accordance with the international law and the Geneva Conventions. John Ismay, New York Times.
Hi there. Has the Pentagon determined what kind of weapon was used in the attack on the Mariupol theater, such as like an ice scanner, ballistic missile, or a cruise missile? And can you say which airfields Russian warplanes, both their fast movers and their heavy bombers, have been operating from?
John, in all honesty, I can't answer either of those questions. I don't think we have details on the theater attack in terms of what munitions were applied, and I couldn't give you a list of airfields here today. I would just say that the vast majority, and I mean the vast majority, of air strikes that are being conducted in Ukraine, at least from aircraft, are taking off and landing in either Russian or Belarusian territory, and it's largely Russian. They're returning to largely, returning to base. Very, very few are actually being launched and recovered inside Ukraine. Yeah, I'll take one more, and then we're gonna have to call it a day. Go ahead, Goel.
Thanks, sir. Two questions. One, Ukraine was invaded by one of the most powerful nations on the earth, and Ukraine is a very tiny nation. The war goes on over a month, still going on. Is there anybody, any leader or any country or any prime minister or president who can tell Mr. Putin to stop killing those innocent people? Because when there is a war, only innocent people are the victims, not politicians, not rich and famous. And where do you put this war as far as Mr. Putin's invasion or Russia's invasion of Afghanistan and now Ukraine's?
Look, I mean, President Biden has, on numerous occasions, had the opportunity to send that message directly to Mr. Putin. We all have, but President Biden has had that, certainly warned Mr. Putin against invading, and made good on severe economic consequences for the result that he made that decision. Other European leaders, President Macron, for an example, has had recent conversations with Vladimir Putin about this. It's not like the international community has not, with small exceptions, has not rallied to the side of Ukraine, and other leaders have tried to impress upon Mr. Putin to end this war. And I would just add, we've called it a war of choice. It absolutely was. He had diplomatic options left to him on the table before he invaded and as he invaded. Those options are still there. He just has to pursue them in good faith. And again, if they're serious about de-escalation, as they claim to be, then send those troops home rather than into Belarus to resupply. Did you have one more?
John, as far as the United Nations is concerned, there are almost 200 members of the United Nations around the globe. Many of them are rogue nations still in the UN. What is the future of the United Nations and where the UN stands as far as the invasion of Ukraine by Russia?
You've seen the UN Security Council hold many sessions in just the last couple of weeks about the situation in Ukraine. In fact, I think they just did one the other day, Monday, I believe, on the humanitarian catastrophe that Mr. Putin is causing inside Ukraine. The UN is engaged on this issue, as they should. I can't speak for every nation state inside the UN, but again, I think obviously not every nation has taken the same stance on Russia that the majority have, but the majority have, and the UN continues to stay engaged on this.
Finally, you think Russia and China should remain on the United Nations Security Council?
That's not a decision for the Department of Defense to make, but I appreciate the question. All right, thanks, everybody. Got to call it there.